So some scribes added stuff in or took stuff out. Again, let's look at Genesis 10, verse 5. From these the coastland people spread. These are the descendants of Japheth in their lands with their own languages and by their families and their nations. There's a little Z. If you look down at the bottom where the Z is, Hebrew lacks. These are the descendants of Japheth. So there's some things that are missing, some things that are added in again. Look at Genesis 18:22. So the men turned from there and went towards Sodom while Abraham remained standing before the Lord. And then there's a note that says C. If you look down at the bottom, another ancient tradition, meaning other ancient copies, read, while the Lord remained standing before Abraham. So some of them say Abraham stood before the Lord. The others say the Lord stood before Abraham. Now this is a minor thing. It's not particularly relevant to the story itself. But sometimes the scribes would reverse things when copying. Now this is a minor reversal. Sometimes there are more important reversals. Look in 1 Samuel 13:1. You might pause the video if you want to look for the passage. 1 Samuel 13:1. Saul was ... Oh, I lost my place. Saul was ... blank years old when he began to reign, and he reigned ... blank and 2 years over Israel. Now, if you look at footnote B and C, the number is lacking in the Hebrew text. The whole verse is lacking in the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Hebrew text. C, 2 is not the entire number. Something is dropped out. So at some point, somebody's apparently intentionally taken out how old Saul was and how many years he reigned over Israel. So things have been removed from the text. Maybe intentionally, maybe not. My guess is probably intentionally. These are small things, but let's look at something that's much more major. If you look at the Gospel of Mark, this is the second Gospel in order in the New Testament. Let's look at the end of the Gospel of Mark. Mark 16. And look at 16 verse 8. This is at the end of the Gospel of Mark. So they went out and fled from the tomb for terror. So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. If you look at footnote S, some of the most ancient authorities bring the book to a close at the end of verse 8. Now I'm not going to read the whole footnote, but what you have is some of these versions of the book end with that verse. Other versions have a little short ending that goes on, and that version says, and all that had been commanded them they told briefly to those around Peter. There's 2 more lines. Then there are other versions that have a longer ending. Now, in most of the other Gospels, after Jesus rises from the dead, he runs into people and talks to them, and they see him, and etc. In this short version of the Gospel of Mark, the one that ends with 8, Jesus just disappears and nobody ever sees him again. In this short version, it says that he briefly talked to the people. In the longer version, somebody's added this story about how he talks to a number of people. Like there's a whole story about him talking to Mary Magdalene and 2 disciples, etc. Guess what? The oldest versions, the oldest copies that we have, don't have those longer stories. What does that tell us? That means that this book, the Gospel of Mark, was presumably written without that addition. Some people thought, hey, that ended too shortly. We need to add stuff in. They went ahead and added this section about him talking to Mary Magdalene and these other 2 disciples. The oldest versions of the Gospel of Mark do not have that. Somebody at some point decided that they needed to either add a story that they had heard or make something up and add it in, but we have these not minor additions but major additions, like a whole half a page worth of additions to the Gospel of Mark.